Thank you all for coming. And I will say up front that when we were asked to give these talks, we were asked to give them in the format of a TED Talk. That was kind of the guidelines we were given. So if you've watched any TED Talks, you realize that they are in a particular style and they tend to be very low in data, right? And so we have purposefully tried to minimize the amount of data that we're going to show, and any data that we do show is going to be in a hopefully digestible manner. But that's, if you're wondering why the style of this is a little different, that's why. And we'll see, it's certainly not a TED Talk per se, but that was what we were kind of asked. So I'll ask you this. What is agriculture at its most kind of fundamental, basic, physical and biological level? What is it? And I would say that agriculture is the purposeful extraction of energy from the sun in a way that human beings can use it, right? Now, we cannot derive energy from the sun directly, of course. But plants can through photosynthesis, right? And if you look at the equation for photosynthesis, it's light energy plus carbon dioxide and water. And the outcome of that is sugar and oxygen, which is really convenient as well, the oxygen, right? So that's really the crux of agriculture, right? We are trying to do this using plants. And then we eat the plants, right? So we harvest the sun's energy in the plants, and then we get that energy when we eat those plants. Or by eating the animals that eat the plants, or the animal products, right? Such as milk. But it all really comes down to the plants. Right? So how can we get plants to harvest as much of the sun's energy for our use as possible? That's agriculture, I would say, at its most basic level. Of course, you need some other things to make this work, right? You need the other resources that allow plant growth. You need water, you need nutrients, you need heat to enable those biochemical reactions to occur, and then you need space for those plants to exist and grow in. Now, ideally, we would harvest the sun all year round through plant production, right? That would be the ideal. That would be food security. And of course, there are parts of the world where we cannot do that because some of those critical resources are not available, right? In this case, we don't have the heat necessary to power those reactions. And there's a lot of other reasons why as well, right? And then there's areas that might look like this, where we can harvest some of the sun's energy, but not enough, right? Because we're limited in a critical resource. In this case, that resource is water. Now, in areas of the earth where we're limited, we can bring those resources in, right? So we can add those resources that we might be missing, such as this case where we brought in water from another location. And we certainly do that in other areas if we're missing nutrients or other resources that power plant growth. But there's often trade-offs with that, right? So if we're extracting it from one location to use it in another location, then we're potentially depleting that. So this is Lake Mead that supplies a lot of the water to Arizona, where that first picture was taken. So there can be trade-offs, right? But let's bring our thinking back to our neck of the woods here in New Hampshire. So what limits our ability to harvest the sun's energy in plants here in New Hampshire? Well, obviously we're lacking the required heat units for a good portion of the year. We tend to be plentiful in water, right? But we also know that there's portions of the year, portions of our growing season where we sometimes lack available water, and maybe it's even too hot too. And so this is the drought map from the Great Drought of 2016, which many of you probably remember. And so here in New Hampshire, where ideally we would be harvesting the sun's energy year-round, it really looks more like this, right? We can really only do that for a portion of the year. And so we're thinking about forages in this context, right? We can harvest the sun's energy in greenhouses and other structures where we can control the climate. But if we're talking about forages and we're talking about livestock production, we're talking about dairy production in particular, this is the period of time when we can effectively harvest the sun. Now, of course, our cows don't starve during the other periods of the year, right? And that's because we harvest as much as we can, where we can, when we can, and then save that for those other portions of the year when we cannot grow it. Or, I should say, or, we import the sun's energy from another part of the country in the form of grain, right? But that's expensive, right? It's expensive in a number of different dimensions that we might think about it. It's monetarily expensive, and that price often depends on what's happening in those regions of the country where that grain is being produced in terms of weather or markets, right? And so it would be really fantastic if we could figure out ways to harvest more of the sun's energy and plant materials here in New Hampshire in our farming systems. All right, and so that's kind of the gist of today's talk. And there's really two broad strategies to grow more plants, right? To harvest more of the sun's energy and plant material. The first broad strategy is to grow more plants on the same area of land, right? More on the same soil, right? And that's known as intensification. So agricultural intensification. That's one broad set of strategies. And there's a number of ways to intensify forage production or plant production and the harvest of the sun's energy through things like fertilizer use and agronomic practices, what have you. The other broad strategy is to grow plants on more land, right? Effectively create more land area, more agricultural land. So those are the two broad strategies for harvesting more of the sun's energy here in New Hampshire and New England more broadly. And we're going to talk about both of these strategies, though we're going to focus on the intensification strategy. And in most parts of the world, that's really where a lot of the research is centered, is on this intensification strategy. And that is because most of the available agricultural land is already being farmed, right? So there's not a lot of new land that we could utilize. So that's why a lot of the work is on intensification. It just so happens that here in New Hampshire and in various areas of New England, there may be some opportunities for actual extensification, bringing some more land into production. And I'm going to talk about that just a little bit at the very end if we have time. But let's first focus on this intensification strategy. So our grazing systems are primarily based on perennial cool season grasses. Perennial cool season grasses and legumes. And because they're perennial, they tend to take a little bit of time to ramp up in the spring, but they do most of their growing and capturing of the sun's energy in the cooler seasons, cooler portions of the grazing season. And then often in the middle of the summer, they'll tend to reduce their growth or maybe even go dormant for a time, and that's known as the summer slump. So that's why we have this hump here, right? And so the first thing I want to talk about is a set of experiments and projects that we've been running for the past 4 years now, asking the question, can we identify annual forage crops, so not perennial forage crops, but annual forage crops that might fill in some of these gaps in the perennial forage growing season? So can we identify cool season annuals that might be more productive in the early portion of the growing season to fill in this niche here, right? Or some warm season annuals that might be productive during the summer slump and then fill in that gap there. And some more cool season annuals for the back end of the growing season there. So that's what we're going to talk about first. And so here are the species that we've been investigating. These are the annual forage crops. So we've got 5 species that we've been looking at to fill this spring niche, we'll call it. 6 species to fill this summer niche. And then another 6 species to potentially fill this fall niche in the growing season. And you can see that some of the species are repeated in some of these niches, right? So we've got oats in those 2 niches. And we picked these species from a large suite of options. And I just wanted to show you this, and maybe you've seen it. It's called the cover crop chart, and it was developed by the USDA. That is kind of a really convenient way of characterizing different cover crops in this case, but these could all be considered annual forage crops just as easily. And it breaks them into your cool season grasses, non-legume broadleaf, and legume species, and your warm season legumes, non-legume broadleaf, and grass species. And so we tried to pull from a diversity of these different types of annual forage crops, and that's how we ended up with this list. And you can see that each niche, each group of species includes a legume, right? So those are your nitrogen fixers. Each includes a number of different grasses, annual grasses. And then the summer niche includes 1 non-legume broadleaf species, while the fall niche includes 2 different non-legume broadleaf species. So those are the species we were interested in. In addition, we were also interested in mixtures, right? So we wanted to grow those as monocultures, but we also wanted to grow them all together in a seasonal mix. So we combined all of the cool season spring niche species into what we called a spring mix, all seeded at 1/5 of their standard rates in this mixture. So total amount of seed is the same, but just the proportions have been changed. And then we have a summer mix and a fall mix. And just for fun, we also included a 14 species mix in each of those groups there. And that 14 species mix includes all of the species across all 3 niches there. Does that make sense so far? The timing of planting and growth, you can see here for those spring niche species, monocultures, and the mixtures. They were all planted the previous fall, and then they overwinter, and then they start growing, as early as possible in the spring, and then this is the kind of peak period of growth. And our summer niche species were planted in early June, and we let those go into this kind of early August. And our fall niche species we plant in kind of mid-August, and those go through November. And then this is where we collect our data about how well these species are performing. And we did that 3 times for each of these groups, right? And so the idea here is, what do these forages look like if we harvest them early? What happens if we wait a little while and then harvest, or wait even longer to harvest, right? How much more growth do we get the later we harvest? Oops, sorry. And then we did that 3 times, so for 3 years. So it was actually a really complicated experiment, because there's a lot of moving pieces. You're planting one group of species at this time, you're trying to harvest another, and I have my lab partner, Nick Warren, managed this entire experiment, and he has Excel spreadsheets showing all the activities, and we did this on this day, and it's insane. And so he gets all the credit for pulling this really kind of complicated experiment off. So it would not have happened without Nick. And I just want to, again, reiterate what we're doing here. We are looking for annual forage crops that will fill these gaps in the typical perennial forage production season. So just some pictures to show you what this all looked like. So here, this picture is for when we were planting the summer niche species. So that's our small plot grain drill. Here's a picture from the spring niche species in April. Right, you can see that a lot of them are really starting to green up. Maybe some of them haven't made it through the winter. Here's a picture of the summer niche species in kind of the height of their growth. This is this is the buckwheat monoculture here. Here's a picture of the summer niche mixture. You can see it's a mixture because it's got the buckwheat flowers in there, and you can see the grasses in there. So this is all 6 of those species together. And there's one of the monocultures. Here's a picture of the fall niche species taken in November 10. You can see there's still a lot of green material there. You can see this treatment, we've harvested it at some point. So just to give you a sense of what this experiment looked like on the ground. And I should say all of this was done at the Kingman Research Farm, UNH's Kingman Research Farm.
Can I ask you, this is meant to be grazed though, right?
We're going to get to that, how you would actually utilize these. But ideally, these would be fed to animals, yes. Either as grazed or harvested and then carried and fed. All right, so here's the data. This is like the This is the most data-heavy part of my portion of the talk, and then Andre's going to follow after me. And what I'm showing you here are the dry matter yields, right? This is how much of the sun's energy we converted into plant material, dry plant material, in the 3 harvest dates for each of those niches. Right? So dry matter yields, harvest date. So this is harvesting early, harvesting later, harvesting really late for each of these niches. And what I'm showing you here are the highest producing species in each niche and the lowest producing species in each niche. And you can see that in all 3 cases, our legume is our lowest producer in all 3 niches, chickling vetch in this case, sun hemp in this case. Triticale was our highest producer in the spring niche. Buckwheat was our highest producer in the summer niche. And then depending on when you harvested, it was either canola if you harvested early, or if you waited to harvest, then it was wheat that was the highest biomass, dry matter producing species. Yes?
Are those yields in the monocultures or in the mixes?
These are the yields in the monocultures.
Is this the average of the 3 years?
This is the average of the last 2 years. Now I'm going to show you those mixtures. So here are the mixtures. Hopefully you can distinguish between the light blue, which is always the spring mix or the summer mix or the fall mix, and the dark blue, which is those 14 species mixtures. And in the spring niche and the summer niche, it's those seasonal mixtures which tended to do better than the 14 species mixtures. But in the fall niche, it's actually that 14 species mixture that does better, at least in the first 2 cuttings, than our fall mix. The fall mix does better at the end there. So mixing these species, mixtures in general, don't necessarily produce more dry matter than the best producing species in monoculture, but they also don't do too bad either, especially these lower diversity mixtures, the spring mix and the summer mix. And then I'll just input the rest of the data, so the rest of the species there, and you can see they kind of fall out in the middle. Now, when we're capturing the sun's energy in forages, the amount of dry matter that we produce from that process is only part of the story, right? The other part is the nutritional quality of that forage. And in general, we know that there tends to be a trade-off between dry matter production and nutritional quality, such that as dry matter or yield increases, nutritional quality tends to decline, right? So that's a kind of a fundamental trade-off, and that's related to the maturity of the forage. And so I wanted to show you what that looks like with our data, and I'm just going to show you the summer niche species to keep it simple. And sure enough, 2 kind of variables of forage nutritional quality, total digestible nutrients, and crude protein. You can see that in all cases, as we delay harvesting, those tend to decline, right? And I'll also point out that our highest dry matter producing species, which was buckwheat, is actually our lowest in terms of these 2 indices of quality, right? There's the buckwheat, there's the buckwheat. And that our lowest producing dry matter species, which was the legume, chickling vetch, tends to be the highest. But again, it depends on when you harvest too. And so what this allows us to do then is to examine these trade-offs. And I'm just showing an example, right? This is for millet, which was one of the kind of middle of the road species in that summer niche. But we can now assess how yield changes the longer we wait to harvest versus quality, in this case, crude protein, right? And we could potentially then use this information to identify kind of the sweet spot where you're hopefully getting the best of both worlds in terms of dry matter production and quality. Now, there's a question about what do you do with these, right? And that's an open question. So I found this picture from Nebraska where they've also been experimenting with annual forages to extend the grazing season. And this is a really kind of intriguing system where they're harvesting these annual forages and then putting them into windrows. And then they run the cattle through, with some tight grazing, and they're basically going down a buffet line and grazing that. And what they say is that when they do that in this fashion, they get a lot more intake because there's a lot less trampling, right? And so they can increase their intake by 40, 50, 60%. So we're actually really kind of intrigued in this, and we might do some work in this area. Then the other way to potentially implement this would be through direct grazing. And so I'm going to hand it over to Andre now, who's going to tell you about some of his work in implementing some of this.
Yeah, so moving along here, and I think the idea that Rich was mentioned about, conversion of sun energy into plant energy, and then I'm following up from plant energy to milk energy. So, I think now folks are familiar with the, seasonal production in terms of forage in the Northeast. And Rich mentioned several of those: spring, summer, and fall. This study I'll be showing here was primarily looking at canola as a grazing source to basically fill the fall niche here in terms of that gap in forage production, so trying to extend the grazing season. So we'll be showing some of the data of a recent study that we did at our UNH organic dairy farm. So one of the questions is why brassicas? Brassica species, there's several of them, including rapeseed, canola, turnip, kale, forage radish, swede, several of them. Some data showing that forage trials that they have a high biomass. Rich already mentioned about that in canola. You can see that up to 2 tons of dry matter per acre. One thing that we're very interested in is of high quality. So they produce high quality feed stuff, high in protein, as you can see, usually over than 20%, low fiber and lignin or NDFs, ADFs, or neutral detergent fiber, acid detergent fiber, and high dry matter digestibility. So those would be some of the major motivation to look into them. Another point I want to mention, I will get back into this later, is brassicas also is one of the forage source with the high concentrations of a compound called glucosinolates, which is a defensive metabolites of the plant. And I'll be talking about that in a minute because that there is some implications for the use of brassicas as well. So some of our data, we basically established 2 fields of canola in the farm. The field 1 you can see here, and then field 2. So this is kind of the botanical composition. So it's quite clear that in our fields, about 88% in the field 1 was canola, and in field 2, about 95%. So they basically were well established. We established them through Richard talking about intensified systems. We tillage and then we planted. When you looked at the biomass, you can see the field 1 and field 2, so they produce quite a lot. So you can see that they can actually, these plants can, if they're given the opportunity, can harvest this energy from the sun and then produce biomass. You can see on average would be close to 4,000 pounds per acre, or about 2 tons, so of dry matter, right? Move along here, just to have an idea in terms of the nutritional profile of brassicas, and I'm using here a comparison with baleage. That would be typical grass legume type of baleage that is heavily used in organic farms and also conventional dairies. You can see here some of the traits. You see crude protein. The baleage was high, very good quality as well, 18% versus 25%. The fibers, NDFs, ADFs, and lignin was way lower, as you can see here on canola, right? And if you're talking about energy conversion, sun from energy into product, so sugars represent that quite well. You can see it's increased, almost like 5-fold increase in the concentration of sugars. So that basically energy, available for lactating dairy cow. Also, if you look at net energy for lactation, was also higher due to this low fiber and also high concentration of sugar. So when you're talking about that, it seems to be an interesting, approach to look at canola, in this case for grazing. So going back to the glucosinolates, is this kind of sulfur compounds, and as I said, brassicas are within the plants kingdom. It's the one with the high concentration of glucosinolates. As I said, so glucosinolates are plant secondary metabolites. They basically would protect the plant against predation, and that could be from animals that are grazing or insects, even disease from virus or bacteria. But also, those glucosinolates can bind to iodine and make iodine less available for not only for the cows per se. That's why there is a limitation how much brassicas you can feed. Usually, it's not recommended more than 50% of the dry matter of the animal. And the same thing for people, right? So kale, for instance, is a type of brassica that has those glucosinolates, and we need to be careful in that kind of situation in terms of iodine status for the thyroid gland. But another point is this glucosinolates also has some antimicrobial properties, and that may be related to the drop in methane emissions in some in vitro study that has been done in the past. But you can see here that independent of the glucosinolates, the cows really like it. You can see in this video they really go forward. So, and this again this study was done, we finished in October. And you can see here the pre and post grazing canola field, right? This one was great. You see there's some trampling, as Rich mentioned. This is yet to be grazed. This is another view on the field. You can see here, it's basically the cows grazed quite well. You can see maybe here that this was after the first frost. You see some wilted leaves here, but still the cows grazed that still very well. You can see here as an example. So we had our first frost, and the cows still grazing this very well, even later in the season. We go until early November, where you can see even like yellow type of leaves, but the cows are still grazing that for quite some time. So look at some of the data. If you see here, it's not a surprise, even though that's very high quality forage source coming from brassicas. It's not a surprise that milk production was decreased a little bit. In this group here, that's the cows that got TMR. We basically divide the cows in two groups. A group that was basically staying in the barn consuming TMR, and the other group that had access to the canola. And they had TMR plus canola for grazing. This kind of a practice that a lot of the farmers using, they provide a kind of a break of a grass, for, in this case, canola, either after the milking. We basically use once a day. The cows are grazing during the night. milk production drop. If you see milk production or fat-corrected milk or energy-corrected milk, it dropped between 2 and 4 pounds. And remember that cows have to graze, and they spend energy to graze. And as Rich mentioned, dry matter intake when animals are grazing is not the same if you bring food to them, or if you do like a swatch, like Rich mentioned in terms of that harvest. In this case, there is energy spent by the animal, right? So it's not a surprise that milk production drop a little bit. However, the milk fat and milk protein, so those increase in the brassica, as you can see here, or in the canola group. Probably a dilution effect, so that overall the yield or the production of protein and production of fat was not different between treatments, right? Because of this trade-off. So another thing that was mentioned was not all the sun energy converted to plants and then converted to animals is actually 100% efficient process. There is some energy losses, and methane is basically how ruminants release some of that energy as a part of the fermentation process. It's a kind of a byproduct of fermentation. So there is some 10 to 15% of the gross energy consumed by an animal, like a ruminant, will be released as methane. So methane has this implication, being loss of energy, but also is a greenhouse gas implicated with climate change. So we have been looking to measuring methane in grazing now, both dairies, in the conventional dairy, in the organic dairy as well. So you can see here the equipment that we used. So the animal will have, there's a head chamber here. There is a RFID tag that will identify the animal and then release some pellets. So while the cows are consuming that pellet and through eructation or belching, so that gas is captured by the system. There's sample flow here, and there is methane and CO2 sensors. There is a head position sensor that will look at the nostril proximity to the chamber and discard data that are not good. And this is basically real-time data collection. You basically can see in your cell phone if the cows get in or not, and if they're, can get the data like that. So this is the application. You can see how we set up in the barn in this study. So the cows will come from here. And again, we set up the system so the animals can have access 4 or 5 times a day. Otherwise, they'll be all day looking for the grain. So and then we take several measurements. So that's kind of the barn application of the system. And we also have the pasture application. So in this study, the cows were having access to the brassicas during the night. So they basically had access to the system as well, as you can see here. And you can see a cow right there taking a measurement. So with that, we can have this integrated approach and get, the good thing about the system, you can get a lot of data over time. And here's some of the data. You see methane production in grams per day dropped in that group, in the cows that have access to the canola. You still need to better look into this data, take a better look, because it could be related to the glucosinolates that I mentioned, could be related to the less dry matter intake. We don't have that data yet, but it doesn't matter how you show this data, if it's on a production base or on a grams per kilo of dry matter intake, it dropped as well. So the lower, the better. Indicates that overall it's more efficient system. And also in terms of milk or energy corrected milk, which is basically called methane intensity, also drop. So it seems that, again, we still don't know the full aspect of this in terms of to explain the data, because we don't have all the data, but it indicates that canola, in this case, it dropped methane if you look at different types of measurements of methane emissions. I think that's my part, and I think Rich will finalize some of his data here.
And so I'm going to wrap this up, and we're getting close to the end of time, and I want to make sure I leave enough time for any questions, so I'm going to go through this last bit pretty quickly. We've just talked about this kind of intensification approach to increasing the ability to harvest the sun's energy. And there is this extensification approach as well, and this is basically growing more plants on more land. And as you know, here in New England and in New Hampshire particularly, we are blessed with a lot of forested cover. In fact, we are the most forested state in the United States on a percent area basis. And so most of our land that is not in cities or towns or houses or agricultural fields is in forested cover. And in fact, a lot of that forested cover is located on farms. So the percentage of total farmland classified as woodland is very high in the New England states. And in fact, it's the highest in New Hampshire. So greater than 60% of the farmland that is classified as farmland has significant forest cover. And so it makes sense that if we're looking to increase the amount of land for agriculture, then we have to think about this forested land. And one way to think about that is in the context of a system called silvopasture, right? Where this forested land is maybe thinned so that we have maybe 30% of the canopy remaining, and we grow forages under that canopy, right? So we're increasing the light penetration so that the forages have access to that light. And that's the idea of silvopasture. And there's been a lot of interest in silvopasture systems recently. And so a definition of silvopasture is this: the deliberate integration of livestock and timber or tree crops. And the deliberate and integration are the two keywords here. It's not grazing cows in the forest, right? It's grazing cows on managed forages in a managed tree crop or timber system. So there's forestry components and livestock management components to this to make a system like this work. And so, this would be an open pasture out at the organic dairy, UNH's organic dairy, and this would be a silvopasture. This is not the organic dairy. My colleagues recently interviewed farmers who are utilizing silvopastures and asked basically, what are your reasons for creating and managing silvopastures? And you can see that of the 20 farmers that were interviewed across New England, shade for livestock was kind of the most common reason listed among many. But then the next most common was expanding pasture acreage. And the fourth most common was increased forage availability during midsummer and droughts, right? Because in these silvopastures, they're a little cooler, little less heat intensive, and so some of these summer forages and cool season perennial grasses do better in that system, at least during those really droughty and hot periods. So there's a lot of reasons why farmers are interested in silvopastures. Here's just a couple examples that will, just so you can see what this looks like. These are from various silvopastures across the region. This is a sugar bush silvopasture where the sap lines are elevated so that the cows can go through there, and then the sap goes down to a greenhouse where they do the sap boiling. It's very interesting looking system. Here's an example from a silvopasture at North Branch Farm in New York, where we've collected a lot of data actually. These are replicated silvopastures. Here's another picture from that same farm. And what we've been really interested in is what happens when you convert a forest into a silvopasture. What happens from the forage production side, but also what happens to the carbon and the nitrogen and the soils and all of that from a kind of an ecosystem environmental perspective as well. And so at the UNH Organic Dairy, not too far from campus, we have established a very large-scale silvopasture experiment where we've basically created a silvopasture by clearing about 70% of the trees. We've also created an open pasture, right? And that's right up against our mature pastures where Andre was doing his work, so that we can see and track what happens over time through the establishment phase of this. Just some pictures from the early days of the establishment. You can see the forage levels are pretty low here. We planted some cool season perennial grasses and legumes in these, and they took to some degree, but not as much as we would like for various reasons. But we're measuring a whole host of things, and that's the topic of a whole nother TED Talk maybe next year or something when we've analyzed all those data. So we don't have a whole lot to say about that right now, other than folks are interested in these systems. We hope we can provide some information to those folks, and they're being practiced across our region for sure. And so with that, with a little bit of time left, I'd just like to say on behalf of Andre and myself, thank you for coming. And there's the funders of our various projects.